7, 6, 5, 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
We close with good night, good luck, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Welcome to Next Giant Leap, a podcast from GZERO's Blue Circle Studio and produced in partnership with MDA Space. I'm Mike Massimino, Columbia professor and former NASA astronaut.
And I'm Mike Greenley, CEO of MDA Space, a global leader in communication satellites, Earth and space observation, and space exploration and infrastructure.
When most of us think about the space industry, we imagine rocket launches, space stations, and moon landings. But behind the scenes, a powerful economic engine is taking shape. This new economy touches nearly every aspect of modern life, from the weather app you check every morning to the GPS you use to get to work every day. That's why some estimate that the value of the space industry could reach as high as $1.8 trillion by 2035. This rapidly expanding sector is reshaping everything from everyday conveniences to global markets. So how do we make the most of this moment? And what could it mean for jobs, investment, and innovation here on the ground?
Today on Next Giant Leap, we're uncovering how the space economy is becoming a powerful force in our lives and where it might take us next.
All right, Mike, what technologies do we use every day that originated from space programs?
I think they estimate now that space touches people's lives like 20 times a day. And so I think it's more about how the technologies and the things in our everyday life are influenced by space as opposed to actual technologies that have come from space down to Earth. For example, like we're not all using space shuttle toilets or anything like that, you know.
No, I wouldn't recommend it, actually.
No, I figured you wouldn't recommend it.
I wanted the real one when I got back.
That wasn't fun. But in terms of like, obviously, like you say, getting up every day, increasingly so, our lives are influenced by space. So, you know, the traditional things the last number of years have been the positioning, navigation, and timing satellites that have given us our GPS, our timing signals in all our banks, all our synchronization and all of our trading, all of our positioning for be able to do navigation. The imagery that goes in those systems, the Earth observation satellites are giving us our satellite imagery that we're using in all of those applications that we use every day, for sure. We're seeing our communications being dramatically impacted. I think it's really cool how over the next few years with the increase in low Earth orbit constellations that we'll be able to bring data connectivity to everywhere in the world, including a third of the world that's not on the internet yet. Direct-to-device communications everywhere in the world. So your cell phone's going to work 5 years from now. Doesn't matter where you are on Earth. You're going to be able to make a cell phone, at least a text, maybe not a call yet, but that'll come. And so the dependency is increasingly high.
You know, like we used to say that, going to space is all about life on Earth, right? That's what we say about the space station. And when I went to space, Mike, I didn't bring a wallet or anything with me, no credit card, nothing. It all gets spent here on the ground, right? All of it is here to benefit us. Even I don't realize everything that we have every day that impacts our life from the space program. So Thanks, Mike, for that. All right, now it's time to bring in an expert who has spent a lot of time focusing on the potential economic opportunities within the space economy. Alex MacDonald is a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Aerospace Security Project. Previously, he served as NASA's Chief Economist. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Mike, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Alex, just to get going a little bit, how did you become interested in the economics of space? That seems like a unique thing for someone to get involved in.
Well, Mike, I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, and I remember very distinctly, the moment I knew I wasn't going to become an astronaut because I got glasses in grade 4. Back in the day, you couldn't become an astronaut if you needed corrective lenses. Thankfully, we fixed that. So kudos to the medical team there at NASA for that one. But, I then kind of went down a path of the economics and really also economic history in particular. And I remember very distinctly another moment, which was when I saw the flight of Spaceship One. Spaceship One was the first time that a privately funded vehicle took humans above 100 kilometers, above the Von Karman line, which is kind of one of the internationally defined definitions of space. And I remember looking at that, and this was Burt Rutan's vehicle, Spaceship One, that won the original X Prize. And I kind of asked a very simple question, which was, how long have we been spending our own money on space exploration. And I was a master's student in economics at the University of British Columbia. And that led me into just really looking up every single astronomical observatory I could find and every single space program and trying to figure out how long this history of private expenditure on space exploration had been going on. How do we as societies allocate our resources to create the types of vehicle that Mike flew on, right? How and why does that happen? Because it's such an incredible technological feat. But if you're an economist and you look at how much these things cost, it's quite an amazing economic feat as well, that we as societies allocate our resources for these things. And so I became very interested at that point, and I wrote basically a dissertation on the economic history of space exploration, focusing on the early origins. And when you look at the early origins, the interesting thing is that long before NASA existed, private individuals, and particularly billionaires, spent their own money building the largest telescopes in the world. When you look at who built the largest telescopes in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was the Andrew Carnegies and the John D. Rockefellers. And so this led me to start to see, the world that now we live in. When I was doing this research, it was really 2005. People hadn't really heard of Elon Musk much back then. And Jeff Bezos had only recently started his rocket company. And it led me to kind of start to see, hey, if the historical trends hold, it is very likely that the wealthiest people in society will once again become major elements of space exploration, simply because they had been before. That was how I got my start. And I used to joke that once you do a PhD in the economic history of space exploration, there's almost nowhere else that can employ you other than NASA. That was maybe true 20 years ago. Today, it's not actually, because the interest in space and the investment in space is so significant that there's actually a burgeoning kind of subsector of space economics, which frankly, I'm delighted to see.
I find that to be fascinating, Alex. I never knew any of that stuff. I never even thought to think about it in that way I thought this was a fairly new thing. Jeff Bezos grew up, he's about my age, so he grew up with, people going to the moon and stuff and had that great interest. And so when he was able to spend some money, he did it on developing, the Blue Origin company and so on. That's an amazing story that even way back when, those rich individuals were looking, and that was what was available to them, right? We didn't have rockets or space stations, but you could look at a telescope and they wanted to get a better view of it. And so they built better ones on their own dime.
And they spent quite a lot. So when you do the kind of inflation-adjusted metrics, right, how much were these telescopes? The telescopes at Mount Wilson Observatory, Mount Palomar Observatory, these are some of the largest in their day, built by Carnegie and Rockefeller. Wow. Each were $500 million to $1 billion in today's terms from a GDP ratio perspective. And to put it another way, one of my favorite examples is James Lick. James Lick was the richest man in California in the 1870s after the gold rush, so good time to be a kind of a property speculator, which he was. And he gave 17.5% of his entire estate when he died to a single project. And initially he thought he might build a pyramid in downtown San Francisco, and people kind of dissuaded him from that. And so some astronomers got onto him and said, well, how about you build the world's largest telescope on the top of a mountain? Because of course, if you build a telescope on a mountain, you can see farther. And he said, well, okay, but can I be buried underneath it? Being smart astronomers, they said, yes, sir, absolutely. If you pay for it, you can be buried wherever you want. And he spent 17.5% of his entire estate on this one project. He was the richest man in California. If the richest man in California, or maybe Texas, as the case may be today, or Washington State, as the case may be, you're looking at people who have $300 to $400 billion, right? And so you're looking at, literally ISS levels of expenditure, right? Getting up close to $100 billion, $50 to $100 billion of expenditure, of precedence. Now, we haven't seen that yet, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos is certainly spending kind of $1 billion a year or so is the reported number on Blue Origin. So he's not quite up there yet. But all of that just tells me that there really is a lot more potential in private, specifically wealthy individual expenditure in space exploration than I think we commonly allow for.
Was there a break in the action there? Because you mentioned those guys were, I'm familiar with some of them too. I live in New York City, so I parked my car in front of Carnegie's old house. But that was a long time ago, right? That's over 100 years ago, the Gilded Age here, right?
Yeah.
And then, did we have a bit of a gap there with that type of investment, or was it going on and I didn't know that was happening either?
No, it's a great observation, Mike. The big gap, of course, is the Second World War. So the Second World War transforms the R&D enterprise of really the entire Western world, but in this case, particularly the United States. And that whole era of defense funding becomes then the new main source of economic support for rocketry development. And you also thus start seeing similar phenomena to what we see today. In fact, the very first venture capital funded rocketry company is funded not in the last 30 years, but in 1947, shortly after the Second World War. And Reaction Motors Incorporated is formed and funded by Laurent Rockefeller, one of the early venture capitalists. So it was no longer philanthropies who were funding at that time, because frankly, the government began to be interested in rocketry in a new way.
Interesting. Well, this is fascinating. Thank you, Alex. Let's maybe come a little bit closer to what's going on now. You served as NASA's very first chief economist. So what was going on as the first chief economist? What did you do in that role?
Well, so that role was created in 2019. And I was serving already in the Office of the Administrator starting in 2016. And what I would say the enduring functions of a chief economist at NASA are essentially economic due diligence on the entire commercial sector. Because, of course, NASA has been one of the principal sources of funding for kind of some of our greatest space aspirations. And NASA has, up until recently, certainly been a $25 billion agency, which is significant. And so what that means is that lots of companies are looking to NASA to support the development of commercial space stations or commercial moon mining or all of these different things that kind of motivate entrepreneurialism in the space sector. And that also dovetails into supporting programs at NASA. So all the programs are trying to achieve these impressive objectives, right? So one of the ones that I'm sure you're familiar with, Mike, of course, the International Space Station National Lab. So one of the roles that I had as chief economist was actually the program executive of the National Lab, because, of course, that provides about $400 million of free resources to companies and universities who want to use the space station to advance their research in some way. But how do you determine which companies get those resources? And so there is due diligence on the business plans for them too, right? What is the production economics of making optical fiber in space? Is that better or less profitable than the production economics of making potentially artificial retinas, right? How do you think about those different things in terms of the costs of their use on the space station and costs of their overall production? You get involved with a lot of those types of questions. But the other thing that, of course, economists always get asked to do is to be able to articulate what the return on the expenditure for NASA's dollars really is. And we did that every 2 years with the Economic Impact Report, where we basically gave the highest resolution of expenditure on NASA's programs across the country. And every single state in the United States received at least $1 million of economic impact. And being able to show that to the stakeholders, being able to show that to Congress, being able to show that to the public was really a critical part, because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, right, none of this gets spent in space, right? There's no deposit bank in space. This is all a way in which we support our engineers and our scientists to achieve things that they might not otherwise be able to achieve in the private sector, right? That's one of the critical roles of government expenditure and of public space agencies like NASA.
Why do you think NASA created this position in the first place, a brand new position like this, Alex, at that time?
The reality is that it had to do with the changing dynamics in the private sector. NASA had not previously, during its first, 50 years or so, dealt with billionaires who were significantly investing in space exploration and increasingly becoming its prime contractors. NASA also hadn't seen kind of the venture capital investment. In fact, one of the best statistics that I always think about kind of representing the changes that we've seen in the last 15 years is when I joined NASA in 2008, the total amount of venture capital, total amount of private capital going into space was about $500 million. And by about 2016, 2017, you were up to around $10 billion. And we haven't been too far from that. It's been up and down since then, but it's rarely been less than about $5 billion. So a huge amount of venture capital began to move into the space, and NASA needed to understand that. And I'd been out in Silicon Valley for a number of years and had kind of seen how venture capitalists worked and how some of the entrepreneurial companies worked. And so really NASA kind of saw that the game was changing, that it really wasn't just government activities anymore that was defining space, that really the new energy was in companies who were pursuing new activities in space, and they understood that economics was a discipline that can give some insight into market dynamics, into competitors, into how markets can develop and what role public dollars and public action can play in that.
So why do you think the space economy has expanded so much recently? Like we're throwing away around these numbers. You're talking about the surge in venture capital. We talk about a global market that these days is around $500 to $600 billion a year. What I always say is the conservative Western forecast, which is, we're going to 1.8 trillion a year by 2035 or so. Why do you think this is driving this expansion in the space economy?
I think the shift that NASA made to buying services unlocked a huge set of opportunities for investors and for entrepreneurs, which increased the incentive, frankly, to found new companies and to invest in them. In the past, NASA would really only do its missions, right? It would operate a spacecraft, it would decide whether to fly Mike or not, depending on whether he'd been, doing well, right? It made all of the decisions related to space. And when it shifted with commercial crew, which, was really a huge shift, as Mike, I'm sure, can attest, in the culture of NASA, there was the human spaceflight side of things, but there was the economic side of things. And the economic side of things said, essentially, that NASA, when it really needs something, is prepared to buy as a service the provision of that activity. And if NASA continues to need that, it will buy it, not necessarily in perpetuity, but it will be a guaranteed source of revenue for a number of years. And so all of a sudden, an amount of revenue that had kind of been locked up in essentially almost being subcontractors to NASA became allowable as a service that then those companies could use to essentially offset the capital costs that they had for production. So for an example, when NASA selected SpaceX for the original COTS investment to launch cargo to the space station, they gave them about $500 million of essentially free money just to develop that capability. But that wasn't actually the most important part. The most important part was step 2, where it said, if you develop this capability, we'll then be contracting for billions of dollars to supply the space station annually, multiple times, with cargo delivery. And that model meant that those companies could build those rockets, own them, sell them to other people. And then if they found other customers, most of the cost of it had been already paid for by these programs, which meant that they found profitable activities in new ways. And that model has now been extended and is being extended actively to many other areas, right? We're using a very similar model when it comes to commercial space stations. We're using very similar models now, even with regard to Earth observation satellites. NASA has a commercial data buy that essentially guarantees the purchase of Earth observation data from commercial companies. And I think there's now about 3 or 4 different companies that are part of that. NASA's even extending the same thing to the lunar surface. NASA's commercial lunar payload services is very much the same model. This created a whole new set of opportunities to win contracts and find investable opportunities. And the sweet spot of this change in NASA's program kind of procurement approach also met, frankly, zero interest rate policies for a number of years on the global markets. And when, money is at zero interest rates, it makes sense to kind of take a few more speculative bets. And space became one of them. And a number of those bets paid off. People used to joke when I started at NASA that one of the best ways to become a millionaire in the space industry was to start out as a billionaire. And, it was a good bit, except that now it's not true. Elon Musk, actually, I think last account, a majority of his net wealth comes from his substantial holdings in SpaceX. And I think I recently saw that Peter Beck, the founder of Rocket Lab, has also now kind of reached the billionaire class because his company, Rocket Lab, has also been so successful. And so when people see those examples, I mean, when I was in Silicon Valley, there's always the fear of missing out. Right? And the fact that a number of people made significant amounts of money meant that other people saw that this was an area to invest in. And we haven't thus far looked back, even with rising interest rates, even though the interest rates have ticked up a few percent here, there's still billions of dollars going into the sector, in part because there's new momentum now coming from, frankly, the defense sector. We're seeing huge changes in kind of defense priorities around the world. So there continue to be a number of different tailwinds that I think is kind of creating the set of opportunities.
So for the layperson out there listening that might not know a lot about how government and industry contracting works, like what you just described is a shift from a past where a government agency like NASA might do a project in space, like go to the moon, but then maybe not do much else for a little while, to a position where they're becoming an anchor customer. They're paying for industry to develop a capability. They're then being a persistent customer of that capability, buying it as a service over and over again, but then enabling industry to sell that capability to other governments or other corporations around the world, which creates a persistent business stream for them in the space economy. So that shift is what has just occurred. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Back in the early days of the space shuttle, you literally could not pay NASA money to fly on the space shuttle. You could be part of an international agreement, right? You could be part of a deal. In fact, that's how a number of Canadian astronauts flew, right? But it wasn't because those were purchased seats. You could not purchase seats. Now you can. And we're starting to see that. I think on the pad there, or shortly coming back to the pad, is Axiom 4, right? The fourth of the fully private missions to the space station, right? These are flights that have no NASA astronauts on them. They're going to the International Space Station. And in fact, it's not even just one company, right? It's one company operating the vehicle with some of their astronauts serving as commander. That's Axiom. And then the actual spacecraft itself is being provided by SpaceX. And so, that exists in part because also NASA is committed to purchasing those same types of vehicle flights for its crew. And of course, Axiom also has its aspirations to build a space station. But NASA's made that exact commitment, right, to enduring human presence in low Earth orbit. And that is spurring a lot of investment, a lot of competition, right? And like in all markets, right, not everyone's going to win, but that's what the nature of market competition looks like. But a lot of people like putting in money to see if they can be the one who win that one. Because if they can, NASA's looking at $1 billion contract annually, I'm sure, to sustain a commercial space station.
This is Houston, contact with a test 1. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
All right, so, Alex, a big part of your role has been involved working with the private companies, including MDA Space. What was it like to work with Mike? Was it pleasant? Or no, I'm kidding, but of course, Mike's company is one of those. How have you seen the private firms shape the growth and direction of the space economy?
I think there's been an evolution on both sides of the public-private, kind of partnership. Because I think you're right. Back in the day, NASA would put out its requirements. Companies would ask NASA, what do you need, right? And we'll build to the specs as best as we can. But that started shifting with both commercial cargo and commercial crew. And we really did start to see it in commercial crew, where some of the companies would basically say, well, yeah, I know you think we may need that, but actually, if we build it that way, that will cost much more, and then we're not going to be able to sustain that. And so actually, we think it needs to look a little bit something more like this. It began to be more of a conversation about the capability that the overall market needed. And that was a hard shift for NASA too. Right? But I think overall what we've seen is companies becoming more assertive, frankly, in communicating to NASA and to government agencies in general. We're in this market. We're trying to make it day to day. We're trying to sell to other customers. If you do a procurement like this, or if you run a program like that, that's going to really inhibit our market over here. So that's going to cost more. So what do you want? Do you want to pay more for the service? However, if you could make this shift here, then that'll allow us to get more market, we think, elsewhere. And we're prepared to take that risk. And a reminder, in these types of partnerships, it's the company that's actually taking more of the risk on than the government. And so that shift in risk has also led to a shift in leverage on the part of industry. And I think we're starting to see industry make use of that more. And we're starting to see, different types of agreements and partnerships than we did in the past.
And Mike Greenley, as the CEO of a big private space company, how is this global competition that has grown over the last few years, how does that impact your business strategy?
It affects it in a number of ways. So you've got the industry around the world now trying to get into space. You've got 90 countries now with space agencies of some form. So you have a lot of players that are involved in doing things in space. But the industrial competition drives you to stay ahead, for sure. Like, it drives you to stay ahead from a technology perspective. So if you go back in some of Alex's commentary, like, way in the past, you'd be waiting for that next government program, and then that next government program would allow you to advance some technology, under a government-funded initiative. Today, with the global industrial competition, to be able to have a solid business in space, we are investing to stay ahead. Our company, has invested over the last 4 years, almost $700 million like of our own money in our technologies for Earth observation, for, digital satellites for communications, and in a commercial line of robotics. And so that's causing you to stay ahead. So in our conversation, that also means you're staying ahead of even the space agencies or the departments of defense. So for me, when I look at that, it's great because it's everything we just talked about with its increase in, commercialization, the role of industry in enabling and maintaining the space economy, and then the competition, which you just asked about, presses us to lean in and stay ahead and go forward. It's very much a persistent thing. So I don't know what you think about it, Alex, as you look at it from there's probably economic terms for this, but before where it was this, big project and then a gap, and we did Challenger for a while and then we didn't do anything for a while. People weren't going into space. But one of my biggest conversations is trying to explain to people, this is a persistent economy now. Like industry and businesses can get into space, they can do business in space, and it will just keep going. You're not waiting for somebody for the next bubble. It's a persistent thing. Do you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that a number of the services that we rely on, as we discussed kind of the top of the program, are in space and will continue to be in space. Telecommunications is the most important, right? Economically, overall, somewhere, 75 to 80% of the economy in space is related in some way to moving information around. In the past, a lot of that's been satellite television. Today, the fastest growing market segment is satellite internet, or other types of connectivity, including kind of business-to-business connectivity and national security connectivity. And that's been just a huge advantage because, of course, space is one of those areas where if you put a set of infrastructure up there, it's up there for a long time, and it actually can see the entirety of the planet. It's very rare for infrastructure to have those characteristics. So we're moving more and more of our infrastructure into space. Some people have grand aspirations of, even building factories up there. I think we're going to be waiting a long time on that, but there's no question that data-related activities are going to continue to be based in space in increasing numbers. It has been significantly increasing over the last decades. And the thing that's changed, and you mentioned this a little bit yourself, that the private sector kind of has to stay ahead of the government in a lot of ways, right? Because there's a lot of pressure just from the commercial sector, right? The substitute good, of course, for different satellite communication constellations isn't other satellite communication constellations, it's terrestrial fiber and other sources of competition. And so in order to beat that, the capabilities for space-based internet have to be better than even what the government is looking for in many cases. And so what that does, as far as I can kind of observe, is it shifts the kind of focus of motivation and innovation from the government policy to the aspirations of individuals, entrepreneurs, and companies. And that's been the big shift, kind of within the space program, not just looking to, with all due respects to Mike, to our astronauts for leadership, looking to our entrepreneurs, looking to the visionaries, looking to the young, students straight out of university who might actually be up to date on what the latest technology is. And so I think that shift towards the individual's aspirations in space, I think, is maybe the most profound. In the past, you really had to join a large institution because all of spaceflight was large and it took a very long time. That is demonstrably not true now. And so we're seeing a proliferation of companies that have a few hundred employees and are building world-leading capabilities. And I think that's frankly the most exciting thing.
Alex, I teach at Columbia University Engineering School, and these students are, they do great work here, and then they want to get a job. So what are some of those jobs that people might not expect that's out there that the space industry's created?
Oh, that's a fun one, Mike. Yeah, there's a number of them. I mean, one of my favorite ones, is the Planetary Defense Coordination Office. So that exists at NASA, and it's their job to coordinate the different activities related to defending the Earth from asteroids. I suppose in theory, if we found other threats coming from space, they could also defend against them. But right now, it's pretty decidedly focused on the asteroids. That's one of them. Another one is essentially in space ethics. How much risk is it appropriate to take on a mission for people, right? How do you weigh those risks? A lot of that gets down to our kind of chief medical officer, obviously, at NASA. But at the end of the day, some of these comes down to ethical questions. If this increases the chance of cancer by 10, 15%, right? Whose decision is it to take that on? Is it more ethical to send someone later in their life where cancer is less likely to be the cause? Or is it unethical to reserve the opportunities only for old people, right? How do you balance these things? And it's actually a fairly vibrant field. And I only mention that one, not because there's a lot of jobs in space ethics. I don't want anyone to get the impression that's a boom and growth area necessarily. But the way to think about it, I think, is to say, look, think about life on Earth. Think about all of the things that we need to have a society on Earth, to have a quality of life that we like. There will be an analogy in space. There is a job in space agriculture. If you like plants and you're interested in the interesting ways in which they behave in space, there's actually a pretty good growth industry in that. It is really a domain of human life. And as a result, there's almost any job that you can think of with a space analogy. You, I'm sure, would have been, a space janitor as well as space researcher when you're up there on the space station, right?
Yeah. It's amazing all the different skills you need to fly. You have to do everything up there, including cleaning up and so on. But I think what I appreciate your answer is that there's a spot for everybody. Within the astronaut office, people ask me, what do you need to do to be an astronaut? There's a wide variety of things. I flew in space with engineers and physicists and test pilots, but also with an oceanographer and a veterinarian and a geologist. But even some of those, what we consider to be maybe non-STEM fields, like in law and other areas, there's a need for all of those fields now, I think, in what we're doing and what we're going to be doing coming up.
Exactly. And there's a need for it whether people recognize it or not, right? So trust me, I didn't get a lot of people who thought there needed to be space economists back in 2005.
Yeah.
So we've had a good conversation about all this today then. We've had the conversation about the growing space economy that is going to be persistent as we move into the future, where there's now all kinds of jobs that are starting to emerge from all the different areas that we mentioned as we industrialize space and it continues to expand more into the future. So we want to thank you, Alex, for your time today and bringing your expertise in space economics, which is, like we said, a very unique perspective to bring. We appreciate that. Thanks very much for being here today.
Well, thanks, Mike and Mike. It's a real honor and a privilege. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks very much to our listeners. I'm Mike Greenley from MDA Space.
And I'm Mike Massimino.
And this is Next Giant Leap. To hear more episodes from this series, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or visit gzeromedia.com/next-giant-leap.
Next Giant Leap is produced by GZERO's Blue Circle Studios for MDA Space. To learn more about partnership opportunities with GZERO, head to gzeromedia.com/advertise.